You don't look hollow, far from it. I am Solaire of Astora, an adherent of the Lord of Sunlight. Now that I am undead, I have come to this great land, the birthplace of Lord Gwyn, to seek my very own son. We are amidst strange beings in a strange land. The flow of time itself is convoluted, with heroes centuries old phasing in and out. The very fabric wavers, and relations shift and obscure. There's no telling how much longer your world and mine will remain in contact.
Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora, and welcome back to Dark Souls 3 Let's Talk Lore. This is episode number 4, being recorded on Friday the 16th of September. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, whenever it is you find yourself watching this. Did you notice how our field of view changed there? So FromSoft specifically wanted this to be a moment where you take in the world. So like right here. Of course it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of, you know, if you were physically walking down here, then the background wouldn't shift like that, but I think it's a cool effect, and it achieves its intended purpose. And I think that is to just show you that even though you've been through this really tortuous area, especially if you're someone who's new to this series, that you still have a very long way to go. And I hesitate to get into it too much at this point because I have spent a lot of time preparing for this episode. In particular for my treatise, I guess you could say, on that in some corners of the community, some aspects of this game, in some cases fairly, but I think more often than not unfairly, it's lol, time is convoluted, lol, not even worth talking about. But we are going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about where it works and where it doesn't, but I do think that in more cases than not, it works quite well. And the reason for that is tied to my assertion the other day. It was either in the previous episode or the episode prior to that, and you'll have to forgive me because it's been almost 2 weeks since I've recorded, that time and space are, at least in our world, time and space are inextricably connected. cannot separate space from time and vice versa. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, because it also involves discussing the ultimate fate of the universe, which might sound silly in the context of discussing a video game, but I think that there's evidence throughout this game that, though FromSoft might not have specifically been referencing these ideas, the ideas that we'll discuss later, it's pretty clear to me that looking at this game and the world, the state of the world especially, through the lens of cosmology, both modern and ancient, that yeah, there's a lot there that could help us explain some of the more questionable aspects of the story that, again, most people just go, lol, fan service, and lol, time convoluted, blah, 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 blah. So, again, it can be made to apply, but not in all instances. So, this is where we're headed. The Undead Settlement. And as we can see, in stark contrast, and of course it's a much lower polygon model than that which we see when we're actually there. And I think that much like in Bloodborne, the world doesn't fit together as well as it's made to seem that it fits together. But this was true all the way back in Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 1, you know, the world certainly fit together better than this game or Dark Souls 2, but there was a fair bit of trickery going on there. One example that comes to mind is when we go to the Tomb of the Giants right outside Nito's boss room, where we're supposed to be seeing sort of the arch trees connected to Ash Lake, but the geography of that doesn't really make any sense. But yeah, the same seems to be happening here. This appears to be Irithyll, and it's interesting just the extent to which it's shrouded in clouds, because otherwise that's a pretty strong hint early on as to the continued existence of Anor Londo. The exact same architecture style. And yeah, so in stark contrast to the splendor and the majesty of this cathedral, which I presume to be Irithyll, but I could be wrong about that, we have the Undead Settlement, which is just, you know, I know there's not building codes or anything like that, but this has got to be the most haphazard thrown together settlement. And we'll talk about the meaning of the word settlement and what I think that might say about the nature of the area. But yeah. Oh, there's so much stuff to talk about. So we might as well just raise our banner. The banner is something that I don't even know if we read the description for it. Small banner held by Lothric messengers, hold up outside the main castle gate to be greeted by an escort. When the high wall appeared, the path to the Undead Settlement was blocked, and messengers came bearing this banner. They were sent out with a duty, but had no way of returning. So, I don't know about all of you, and whether or not, I presume that someone has noted this previously, but I've not personally seen anyone discuss this. But it seems to me that the small Lothric banner, the insignia on it, seems to perhaps be a representation of the dark sign that we see in the sky later on in the game. And perhaps the reason why it's on this banner is so that when we go and we hold up the banner, the Batwing demons who continue to serve the institution of Link in the Fire. Yeah, it's very strange. I'm not sure. So again, even though I think that the cosmological treatise I will provide later in the episode explains a great many things, there are some things that it simply can't explain. And I'm not sure if the Batwing demons are included in that group, but we did get a series of very, very, very helpful and interesting translations provided by Yosaho, and I don't believe, I'm just double checking right now, I don't believe that this item description was among them. And so we'll discuss some of it we'll be discussing in this episode, some of it we'll be discussing in the next episode, because as with the High Wall of Lothric, we'll be splitting this area up into parts. So this is obviously the first part for the Undead Settlement. And I don't know how long I'm going to record today, simply because I am exhausted and feeling a little bit under the weather after a really, really hectic first 2 weeks of the new academic year. But with all that said, I'm curious, Yosaho, if you're watching, as to what the original Japanese text is like for this item description. Because it says, when the high wall appeared. So, suggesting almost that... I don't even know what that's meant to suggest. When the high wall appeared. The path to the Undead Settlement was blocked, and messengers came bearing this banner. So... I presume that it doesn't mean that the high wall just sort of appeared out of thin air, and that what we're seeing in that item description, and again, I don't know, that's why I'm throwing it out there for Yosaho or someone else to have a look at it. But there was an example elsewhere of a simple difference in the word used that makes an enormous difference to the overall item description. Oh, it was Hawkwood's dialogue about Aldrich. It doesn't say that he was developed, it doesn't say they made him, as it does in the English translation. But then again, the dialogue is a fair bit more muddy. I would love to know, I would absolutely love to know how it is that FromSoft goes about that, because my understanding of it is that the dialogue is recorded first in English, or at least at the outset for Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, that the Japanese version of the game actually had English voice actors in it. So is the dialogue written in Japanese, translated to English, and then for the Japanese version of the game translated back into Japanese? If so, because there are a whole lot of problems that can be raised by that. And there are 2 books that I intended to discuss in this episode, but I'm already quoting at length in this episode from 2 other books, so we'll have to return to that. But yeah, Yosaho, if you're out there, I would very much appreciate, and I'm sure everyone else would as well, if you could let us know what the original Japanese text is for the small Lothric banner, because I feel like the word appeared implies a whole bunch of stuff that could simply just have come out of a mistranslation. But with all that said, let's greet the Batwing demon. So again, in very, very, very stark contrast to many of the other areas we visit in the game, this place is a dump. It is an absolute dump. And it bears all the hallmarks of a place that was sort of just thrown together for a population of undesirables. Let's start with the word settlement. So the first definition is obviously not really applicable to the name, the Undead Settlement. But the second one reads, a place, typically one that has hitherto been uninhabited, where people establish a community. The process of settling in a new community, or the action of allowing or helping people to do this. And another definition, or another variation, I guess I would probably add to that last one, which is helping people do this, or allowing or helping. The final variation on that I would add is forcibly confining people to a plot of land. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what has happened here. The when and those responsible for settling the undead in this place is, I think, very much an open question. But it seems obvious to me that, you know, with the way the landscape is warped here on the one hand, and just the shoddy construction of everything on the other. Oh, and I'm just thinking of another book that would be really, really good to bring to bear on this area. But I think I'll save that for the next episode. But for now, we'll talk about, and this is just my interpretation, as always. I don't know if this really fits, but I will share with you the first thing that came to mind once I started really thinking about this place and about what it means to have a very shoddily built plot of land where all of these undead are placed, or all of these undead are settled. And the book that came to mind is by Keith Thor Carlson, and it's called The Power of Place, the Problem of Time, Aboriginal Identity, and Historical Consciousness in the Cauldron of Colonialism. And so, just two brief excerpts. The first one to establish the context for the point that I'm trying to make, and then the second one is the actual point. So, Carlson writes that in 1878, Indian Reserve Commissioner Gilbert Malcolm Sproat was visiting Aboriginal communities throughout Canada's Pacific Province, assessing and determining Aboriginal people's perceived territorial needs, and assigning reserve lands. The effects of his activities, of course, had more far-reaching implications. In creating Indian reserves, Sproat was effectively binding Indigenous people to decidedly European notions of residence and governance. Carlson goes on to argue that once a reserve land base was established, it was possible for the Canadian government to apply the Assimilationist Indian Act. Prior to the creation of reserves, the government had no effective means of monitoring the day-to-day lives of Indian people. Reserves, in other words, facilitated systems of colonial surveillance, and through surveillance, manipulation and control. So, this form of surveillance is different, more intangible, but more powerful than just simply a surveillance camera, a CCTV system. That's obviously not what is happening here. But if you want to control a population, if you want to know who they are, what they do, if you have any designs on reforming them as a people of, in the case of the First Nations of Canada, of taking them and, through the Indian Act, assimilating them into Canadian culture, and that is to say, wiping out their, and attempting to eradicate their own religion, culture, and traditions, simply because it was perceived, their culture, their language, their sort of nomadic lifestyle was perceived by European settlers as primitive. They were trying to civilize them. And so again, I don't know if that's what's happening here, But it's very, and maybe we'll get into this notion of surveillance at a later date in a future episode, because again, we're not talking about video cameras here. We're talking about the type of surveillance that affects your judgment and the way that you behave because of the awareness, because of the knowledge that someone might be watching. This is what Michel Foucault called the automatic functioning of disciplinary power, whereby the knowledge, and it's exemplified by the panopticon. And I know I said I wasn't going to get into it, but just briefly. So the panopticon, a circular, cylindrical prison block with an observation tower in the middle, where the person or persons in the observation tower can see all of the prisoners, but the prisoners cannot, they have no way of verifying whether or not there's someone actually watching them. So if you have no way of knowing whether someone's actually watching you, but you know that someone could be watching you, you're more likely to behave in a manner that your captors, that you think your captors would like you to behave. And again, not necessarily a one-to-one mapping onto this area, but it does seem to me that to some degree, I believe JSF and Theomeny/Cassadev suggested that this place serves a very important economic role in the kingdom, and I think the specifics of that really depends on the timeline and how we understand the sort of expansionist program that Aldrich and Sullivan, I guess, have been advancing of late. But yeah, I'm not really sure. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. Where these hollows came from, and why it is that they are basically being tortured. I'm sure many of you will have ideas about that. But it's not really, other than it, being a really cool and powerful set piece, a scripted event. I'm not really sure what the significance of that is. Presumably an instance perhaps of the inmates running the asylum, as it were. And these two dogs feasting on an alluring skull. A skull resplendent in the scent of souls, prepared by evangelists of the Cathedral of the Deep. Throw to shatter, spreading souls which attract enemies, not effective for all foes. So, I guess this item description here is the first hint that we get. I believe that's actually the first mention in the entire game of the evangelists. Prepared by evangelists of the Cathedral of the Deep. So perhaps this relates to the road of sacrifices and the extent to which this place, which is very reminiscent of Hemwick Charnel Lane in many, 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 many ways, in terms of the atmosphere, the bodies hanging everywhere. I don't know if there are any charnel houses in the same way that there were in Hemwick Charnel Lane, but yeah, very reminiscent. All the way down to the enemies who can be staggered by rolling into them. And so these pilgrims, presumably traveling, as we saw in the introduction, from a faraway land, hoping to reach Lothric Castle, came to this bridge and realized that, yeah, it's no longer connected. So again, I think that this could be explained in part by by the distortion of the landscape as the first flame pulls everything towards it. But I'm not really sure. Because the presence of some of them in between Vort, the boss room for Vort and the Dancer, right at the entrance to Lothric Castle, would seem to suggest that these hollows have been making this pilgrimage for quite some time, and because otherwise how would they have gotten up there? And that at some point there was a cataclysmic event, or maybe it happened more gradually. And you can see, of course, Yol, in stark contrast to the rest of them, it's the only one that's actually moving, whereas the rest are more or less just static models. So, I don't know. I'm interested to hear what everyone else thinks, though, about the pilgrims, why they're here, where they're going, all that stuff. Because obviously it's a question that we'll return to later on, but... So I've not really delved into any of the magic in this game. But I do wonder whether this is a staff we can get at some point.
Please, grant me death. Undo my shackles. Oh, then it's true. A champion of Ash as I live and breathe. To be in your presence is a great honor. I am Yol of Londor, a pilgrim, as you can see, only somehow I failed to die as was ordained. Well, perhaps my calling lies elsewhere. Say, champion of Ash, how does the idea of taking me into your service strike you? I was once a sorcerer. Surely I can be of use.
So again, further to what I pointed out in the previous episode, and I've never actually tried to do this, so hopefully I can change my mind here. I presume that I can, but hopefully we can. That another one of those things that everyone, lol, they just warp, why don't they just warp away? And that's something that I said initially too, but they don't warp to Firelink until we actually give them consent to do so. We have to consent, we have to take them into, we have to accept them into our service. Otherwise...
Yes, of course. A cursed pilgrim has no place in your honorable service. But if a lost soul should encounter a legend such as you, could that be anything but a movement of fate? I will remain in this spot, praying solemnly that you might have a change of heart.
Oh man, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it would be that sad. I'm sorry, friend. So, I don't know how... I guess it can be easy to recognize a champion of Ash when, you see that we have clearly borrowed the power. We've borrowed the embers via the embers that we picked up. And so, we have these glowing embers all around us. But how else is he able to immediately tell that we are a champion of Ash? Which is, even though it's kind of overly heroic, I think I like that term for the player character better than Ashen One. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I do wonder whether there's... Because I think that there might be something to the differences in how we are in in how we're labeled by various different people in the game. So rather than it just being using all these changes, these terms interchangeably, there might be something to that.
Ah, champion of Ash. Have you had a change of heart? I beg of you, take me into your service.
Okay, friend, I'm sorry. I just wanted to demonstrate that point. I just wanted to demonstrate that you can't warp to Firelink without my permission. But you absolutely have my permission.
Oh, I am honored, truly. I should be dead, yet you have granted me purpose anew. I, Yol of Londor, do solemnly swear myself to you.
And again, the exact same visual effect when we warp back to Firelink or to the bonfire. And perhaps these are there to drive that point home, maybe? Bone fragment reduced to white ash. Return to last bonfire used for resting, or to the shrine bonfire. Bonfires are sustained by bones of the undead. In rare cases, their previous owner's strong urge to seek bonfires enchants their bones with the homeward instinct. This is another instance in which I'm not sure if the icon itself is different or if it's just that we're seeing it in higher resolution, that the item description images are higher resolution, because I don't think I ever noticed. It looks almost like it's blood, but it looks also like it could be that part of the bone is split open. And I know almost nothing about the physiology of bones, or if you can even describe it as physiology. I don't even know that. But could that be bone marrow on the inside? Or, again, don't know what bone marrow looks like, but I don't know whether there's anything to that. But an interesting thought, I think, that the homeward bone there sort of, it could just be there for gameplay reasons, but it could also be there as a means of showing to the player, hey, when they warp away, this is what's happening. They are drawing on the so I guess there's two different levels of that, because when we use it, we're drawing on the homeward instinct of an undead from long ago, and when they warp, they are drawing upon us, drawing upon that bone. So I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking too much about that. Oh, alright. Job's over. Time to go home, I guess. See, wonder where this guy even goes. And so crows everywhere. Oh, he just goes and sort of stares off into the distance, eh? But the crows everywhere is something that's really interesting in that it could indicate, on the one hand, of course, just that there are all these dead bodies here, and so the crows are attracted by that. But on the other hand, it could perhaps also be an indication of of this place perhaps having its origins, or initially being tied to the worship of Velka. Velka is one of those subjects from Dark Souls 1 about which I'm not especially knowledgeable, so I will be relying... I hate those delayed overheads. I will be relying in no small part on the knowledge of all you out there in order so that we might piece together those aspects of the storyline. Let's try this again. Come on. Come on. So the bonfires. I'm not going to go into great depth about it just because we got a lot of stuff to cover in this episode, not a lot of time. But, you know, it's another one of those criticisms of the game, which is not entirely unfair. The fact that we have a bonfire up there that is in Vort's boss room. Then we have a bonfire when we get to the area. We kill a few dogs, go through the gate, and then there's another bonfire. So again, as I speculated in the previous episode, I really do think that that this was just the best they could come up with when the mechanic of creating your own bonfires was scrapped for one reason or another. So what they did is they combined the checkpoint approaches from basically all of the past Souls games. So from Demon Souls, we have the mechanic where when you defeat a boss, you get a lamp, or not a lamp, sorry, an archstone. That was also picked up in Bloodborne. And because you'll recall that in neither Dark Souls 1 nor Dark Souls 2 did bosses leave a bonfire. You kill the boss in Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2 unless it was one of the Lord Soul bosses. Those were the only ones who spawned a bonfire. In Dark Souls 2, once you defeated one of the Lord Soul bosses, you would go to a room where there was already a pre-existing bonfire, a primal bonfire as they were called, in which the coiled sword was broken, snapped in half, and sort of lying in pieces on the floor. So this is the only one where every single boss leaves a bonfire. And then the bonfires at the start of each area is something that they took from Bloodborne, where at the start of every single Chalice dungeon, there's a Chamber of the Seal, which basically indicates this is the start of a brand new area. And so I don't think it necessarily works because, again, I don't think they designed the game around having that many bonfires, around combining the approaches, that many different approaches in one. But at the same time, I don't think it's as much of a problem as everyone makes it out to be. It's kind of wonky and clunky and, you know, not especially elegant, but there is another sense in which you could look at the level design of the game that incorporates this is the small leather shield, I think. Yeah. That you can look at the level design in the game, and maybe I should save this point until later because it really does require, as strange as this sounds, once again, it really does require us to talk about the ultimate fate of the universe. So I'll save that point until later, but there is a sense in which, I'll just say briefly for now, that our journey through the game is not only a journey through space, but also a journey through time. And that won't make much sense until, once again, we discuss the ultimate fate of the universe. But hopefully it will at that point. So there's a few things we need to talk about here. The first is obviously Loretta's bone here, or I guess the body of Loretta, which I don't believe the corpse model is unique in any way. I think it's the same as the rest of them, but why she's hanging here is another question. Because insofar as I guess we actually have to hit the... Oh my gosh. That was a fail and a half. Insofar as the thematic connections to Bloodborne go, You'll recall that the Hunter's Mark, as Redgrave initially posited way back when, that the Hunter's Mark seems to be a reference to the Hanged Man. And we see literal and figurative references to this all throughout Bloodborne. And here too. And I guess this was also something that we saw in Demon Souls, so it could also be sort of a thematic reference to Demon Souls as well. And to be clear, again, and we'll go over this later, but my whole Fate of the Universe treatise on time and space being convoluted in Bloodborne wouldn't account, obviously, for things like the Storm Ruler, which are taken from a different game. Not in the same series, so therefore not on the same timeline. But yeah, because in Demon Souls, I believe that Stockpile Thomas's daughter, we find her body hung up in a similar fashion, and you get her hairpin, if I recall correctly. I know a lot about Demon Souls from someone who's never actually played the game. It's kind of funny sometimes. There's obviously tons I don't know, but I'm surprised sometimes by the references that I'm actually able to catch. But yeah, and then we also notice this tree here, which, if you look at the roots and all of the bodies there, sort of just placed, it's almost like a Christmas tree, like those are the gifts under the Christmas tree. So, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in terms of item descriptions to this very helpful translation, once again provided by Yosaho, which is from the Soul of the Cursed Rotted Greatwood, which in Japanese translates roughly to Cursed Belly Great Tree. Ever since its establishment, all manner of curses have managed to seep into the Undead Settlement. The worst of them were sealed away inside a spirit tree. Then the tree began to change. So spirit tree, the red text at the bottom of each of these translations is I think Yosaho's interpretation of the differences, and perhaps this one indicating that sacred tree is would be a better translation than spirit tree, or that when the original text says spirit tree, it means something similar to what we would mean when we say sacred tree. And again, this is another thing that's tied to, because I really, really want to emphasize the uncertainty and the complications that arise when trying to translate from one language to the next. It's not as simple. I feel like most people, especially in this community, most people equate translating text to, and a part of this is, to blame Google Translate and things like that. We have to blame for that, but also just the lack of awareness of the extent to which culture is embedded in language, and that each language permits certain things from being discussed, or precludes the possibility of certain things actually being considered by virtue of how the language is constructed. So it bears the marks of the culture out of which it originated. And the English language, even though it's especially rich in, it's not very rich in verbs, in different types of verbs. So there's some languages which have verbs that apply specifically to inanimate objects, but in English, there really aren't any. So I guess that's just a brief preview of the thing we'll talk about when we return to that subject. But it's not as simple as, say, taking kilometers and converting it, converting between metric and imperial and vice versa. Translating text isn't like translating a different mathematical scale, a different unit of measurement. It's far, far, far more complicated than that. But that's all I'll say about that for now. But this tree here, and of course the first time in the game that we come into contact with one of the evangelists. I came prepared. Thanks once again to the Memetim, who hooked me up with a whole bunch of souls so that I could buy things. But Theomany / Cassidov and JSF pointed out the similarities and the potential that this tree here, which is currently being burned by the evangelist, presumably, and being venerated by the rest of these undead here, whose names I really ought to have looked up before I started, because I would like to imagine that their name has a little bit more information than just undead person or undead worker or whatever. But it seems like this is a very early. This tree is in a very early stage of a transformation that would eventually turn into something akin to the Cursed Rod of Greatwood. And I don't know if there's any connection here, but the bodies hanging from the tree strike me as being very reminiscent to the pods, which hang not only from the Cursed Rod of Greatwood, but that we also see littered throughout the lower swamp in the in Farron Keep. So I don't know if the pods grew out of the bodies that were hanging from the tree, or why they would be, because you know, you can clearly see that with the bodies being burned at the base, that they seem to have been trying to seal away these curses inside of the tree, but then the tree grows. And we have a few comments to this effect, and I'll have to apologize again because we won't have the time to get to nearly as many comments this episode as we did in the previous one. Just because, yeah, the last 2 weeks have been incredibly hectic for me. Teaching a new class in a new department, which means a whole bunch of new requirements in terms of the things that I need to do. And I always have a lot of anxiety and stress at the outset of a new academic year, or when, you know, I'm undertaking something brand new. And this course I'm teaching is very much something that's brand new. It's going to take a lot of work, but I thankfully have much more control over the grading and how the class actually runs than I've ever had before. I'm not doing the lectures. The course director, the professor, is actually the one doing the lectures, but I'm the one who's grading all their assignments, and you know, they hand them in directly to me, which is not something I've ever had before. So it's always been kind of a crapshoot in terms of, well, yeah, you could do this on the assignment, but you know, I might not be the one grading it. So, you know, you want to use like the textbook language. So it's really nice that I can actually have, and whereas previously most of my contracts have been, you know, you lead a tutorial once every few weeks. Oh no. Previously you lead a tutorial once every few weeks. This contract is for every single week I meet with the students.
Cleanse the bastard's curse. Poor child, come to me. Oh, cleanse the bastard's curse.
So yeah, the evangelist. Very, very interesting enemy. Presumably at least a semi-reference to the fat officials from Demon Souls. Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. So I started leveling up basically everything because, again, thanks to the Mammotim, we have plenty of souls to work with. I don't want to be too over-leveled for each area, but I want to be over-leveled enough to the point where, you know, we don't have to worry about me dying over and over again. Because I'm not a pro at these games by any stretch of the imagination. But something I do intend to do is to put a few levels into luck so that we'll be more likely to get rare drops that will give us interesting lore. But and this is one such example. I think we started with 7 luck and upped it to 10. And I don't know if that actually made the difference, but it can't hurt. Gloves of an Evangelist sent from the cathedral. These teachers, all women, came to enlighten inhabitants of the Undead Settlement and sent carriers on the path of sacrifice. So again, perhaps that's what is meant. That's what we're meant to take away from the item description of the Alluring Skull. It says it was prepared by evangelists of the Cathedral of the Deep. So presumably similar, once again, thematically, I guess, but also in terms of, like, you don't really need to have played Bloodborne to, like, gather this point, but I think it's much easier when we have the prior example of the School of Mensis, having all these body parts delivered from Hemwick and Central Yarnum and various other places, so that they can be used in, you know, experiments and rituals and things like that. And so I think that the Alluring Skull, together with, you know, basically everything else here, is suggesting something similar. And the Road of Sacrifices especially, that these body parts are being prepared here and then being sent to the Cathedral of the Deep. Although it doesn't specifically mention... Well, it's specifically mentioned in the Alluring Skull, but not in the gloves. It just says the Cathedral, but it's lowercase, so I don't know. So yeah, I'm pretty convinced at this point, and I'm reasonably certain that and so now that they're all mostly dead, we can get a closer look at the tree here. And worthy of note, once again, we raised this in the episode where I first, I believe where we first came across that pus of man in the High Wall of Lothric. But the fact that humanity is associated with dark and fire, so humanity and fire are opposed to one another, mechanically and also in terms of the story. So one of the main purposes, again, of this playthrough, and one of my main interests in general in these games, is how they integrate gameplay and story. And that's one such instance which you could just so easily miss it if you're not really thinking about it. But the fact that, you know, not only was the evangelist, not only was she burning this tree as a means of, ensuring, perhaps presumably, that it doesn't turn into something akin to the Curse Rod Greatwood, but also when she says, cleanse this bastard's curse. I can't recall what the exact wording was because I play with my volume low, but I will do my best to enhance and put in a couple slow motion shots of what it is that the evangelist is saying. But she wants to cleanse our curse with fire. So yeah, pretty clever, and you know, a nice little detail, and this game is obviously chock full of them. Those little details, and FromSoft games more generally, I think. But just, yeah, I really think that's cool. I also didn't even mention the giant. Who... Yeah, we won't go talk to today, I don't think, but We do have as our burial gift, we chose the Young White Branch, which is a branch of a white birch received from somebody. Apparently, this was once a token of friendship, used to become something that blends into the surroundings, though the branch will unfortunately be consumed. Perhaps treasuring the memory is more important. So I don't know how to explain that, or the burial items more generally. I know that Theomany has some ideas about that, and I think that that's a discussion we'll save for when she joins us for the Untended Graves, but we shall see. And we also picked up Loretta's bone and an Estus shard, the description for which I don't know if we've read yet. Old, discolored human bone with several holes bored into it. A woman's corpse in the Undead Settlement was found clutching this bone. Her name was Loretta. So... it looks like a different bone. And so if I'm to understand this item description the way it's phrased, it would seem that this isn't a bone that was a part of Loretta's body, but a bone that she held with her. Because it says, a woman's corpse in the Undead Settlement was found clutching this bone. Her name was Loretta. So there's a lot of ambiguity there, as it's unclear as to whether or not the her in that last sentence refers to the woman's corpse or to the person to whom this bone belonged, or not belonged, but the person whose body is missing. I don't even know how to phrase that properly. So, but yeah, it looks kind of like the Homer bone. Like it could be, perhaps, if we're to look at this like the Homer bone as sort of a cross section, like I was suggesting earlier, then maybe this is the other side of that. But like because the angle is almost identical, but I don't know. And if it weren't for the damn binoculars being in the way, it'd be much easier to do a comparison. But I'll see if I can do some video editing magic and put them side by side, so that you have the benefit of post-production. Still have not read the... A shard soaked in Estus. Give to the blacksmith at the shrine to increase usages of the Estus flask. In the old days, it was rare to see an Estus flask far from its owner, but this shard offers hope, however shattered. It reminds me of a drawing someone submitted, I think, to the Dark Souls 2 subreddit shortly after the game was released, of, I think it said something to the effect of, you know, what I imagine the Estus flask would look like. And yeah, it's just it's a flask with a bunch of shards just taped onto it, which is pretty awesome. So we picked up a kukri. Small throwing machete. Throw at enemies to cause bleeding damage. A unique weapon originally used by swordsmen of Carthus, but now popular among bandits and thieves. So we're getting a lot of area name drops already. And yeah, this area is just so large that even, you know, I've played this game, I don't even know how many hours. 300 hours, 400 hours, something like that so far. Maybe not that much, but I've played this game a lot. And this is one area I'm still not really, like, I don't have a good route for going through the area. And I'm usually like halfway between, okay, maybe I should go left here, maybe I should go right. But I think this is the way to Hodrick and the Accursed Rod Greatwood boss room. So I think this is where we need to go. So again, just bodies everywhere. And that seems to be the industrial output of this place. Similar to Hemwick Charnel Lane. Body parts. And so, but if I'm right about this place having been initially constructed, hastily constructed, because again, if you look at this just at a distance, earlier in the episode when we were looking sort of at the landscape and all of the really majestic looking buildings, and then just these wooden shacks just sort of stacked on top of one another. Or added to existing structures. Because the definition of settlement would seem to generally imply that it's a place where that wasn't previously inhabited. And to some degree that is inconsistent with what colonialism actually is, in the sense that, you know, when Europeans came and settled North America, they weren't settling in a place that was previously uninhabited. They were displacing people who were there already. But because, as I alluded to earlier, the indigenous people were seen as savages. They weren't civilized. And, you know, that they didn't, even though they had agriculture, but because it wasn't the very particular specific type of agriculture that these European settlers were used to seeing, and because they didn't live in one place and they didn't somehow know to adopt these specific cultural structures of how, you know, society should be organized, they were deemed to be too savage to be left to their own devices and confined to settlements or reserves, and, you know, where these often religious authorities, so religious and state authorities, and so the inclusion of and the role of the evangelists is not only interesting but historically accurate. If we're to look at this place as a place where undead were sort of forcibly confined, not necessarily in an attempt to civilize them, but in an attempt to use them in some form or fashion. To use their bodies, to extract bio-value from their bodies. And again, that's another term that I do intend to properly introduce at some point. And it's a term that I brought up also in my video on Fallout 4 and FF7, Final Fantasy 7. But the notion of bio-value is very interesting, and I think central, not necessarily on purpose, but very, very useful in understanding the world of Dark Souls 3 and the motivations of several of the factions and characters in the game. Because the example I raised in Fallout, in the case of Fallout 4, was the robo-brains, and how you could either look at that as sort of the embodiment of the notion that you are your brain, but also there are robo-brains that weren't used as a secondary body, as a replacement body, but where the brain itself was used as sort of as just a processor for this robot. So that it's not a brain in the sense that we think of a brain as holding the mind, but a brain in the sense of this is a computer. This is the same thing as what you have in your computer. It's a processor for doing computing things. But the bodies of those individuals, and this is, again, I'll raise specific examples later, but the bodies of these individuals are 100% devalued. They do not matter to the rest of society. They do not matter socially. They do not matter economically, culturally, anything like that. They are undesirable people that would otherwise be locked away until they die. But there is one instance in which their bodies are treated as valuable, and that is when you can take body parts from them and extract value out of it. And the Alluring Skull, again, suggests that the evangelists are here to some extent to cleanse curses, but also to organize this bio-economy of body parts, whereby take the bodies of these people that just otherwise they're useless. But if you kill them and you take their body parts, then you can actually get something of value out of them. And so this is the first instance of one of these cages. Okie dokes. Oh, we are fat rolling. I guess that's why I didn't have the torch equipped. Warrior of Sunlight. An ancient talisman depicting a holy symbol bestowed upon the Warriors of Sunlight, equipped to pledge oneself to the Warrior of Sunlight Covenant. Warriors of Sunlight are brilliantly beaming cooperators who place their golden signatures to help those in need, for it is their duty to deliver a great conquest to their summoner. And then we of course have some Estes soup here, which may or may not have been prepared by Sigurd, because we do of course find him here. But this door would probably be open if he had been through here, so I don't know. We'll save that in case we need it. We also had an item to grab up here. And so, I think other than the blue winged knight and the pus of man enemies that we've come across so far, I think this is the only other enemy that has glowing red eyes. Indicating that this person has been tainted by the abyss, or tainted by the darkness of humanity. And the thralls, many of them, many if not most or all of them, seem to have chains around their necks. Similar again to the likes of that which we saw in Yahar'gul in Dark Souls, or sorry, in Dark Souls, in Bloodborne. Okay, let's go drink some Estes soup. So yeah, I don't know how much stuff we're going to be able to do in this episode. I didn't originally intend to speak with Yoel and start dealing with that quest line. But once we do that, I think, because we do already have the key to to where we get the Firekeeper soul and all that stuff. So we could do that in this episode, but I'm not sure if we'll have the time, given the fact that once again we have to discuss the ultimate fate of the universe. I spent basically 2 weeks preparing for my first classes of the semester. The first time I was teaching for the school year was actually supposed to be last Thursday, so that is 8 days ago at the time of recording. But because they didn't have enough TAs to cover all of the different tutorials, they didn't think it would be fair to have some students with tutorials and others not. So that meant that freaked out, spent all this time preparing for the first day of class, and then it wound up being canceled anyway. So then I had to basically revise my lesson plan for the second week to incorporate all of the introductory stuff I had originally planned to do for the first week. So yeah, my week, or the last 2 weeks were incredibly hectic and stressful for me, but I don't think that the classes could have gone better, all things considered. And so after I was done teaching, which they're late classes, which I'm very pleased with, because I would be a horrible teacher if I had to teach in the morning. But pretty much as soon as I got home and I finished, doing my grading and sending out admin-related stuff to my students, I started preparing. I opened a whole can of worms for myself with, oh, I'm gonna die here. With the whole ultimate fate of the universe thing. So, spent a lot of time preparing and put a lot of thought into it. So, I hope that you will all find it interesting and relevant, and I'll just stop teasing it now until we actually get to it. But what did we pick up there? Picked up a whip. So nothing really lore-wise there of note. So let's go get the bonfire. We'll come back for the stuff that we have to do over there later. Because I do want to ensure that we do all the Mound Maker stuff before we go and deal with the Curse-Rotted Greatwood, which my recording's already in an hour, but I know that there's a bunch of stuff that I probably will be cutting out and shortening, rambling and stuff like that didn't really make much sense. Because when I started recording, I was feeling rather under the weather. I'm feeling a little bit better now. I think just because, I get really excited about lore talk and about just the possibilities that this series often presents. And thanks in part to me, but thanks largely to all of you out there. And so you get a much better perspective here on sort of the ragtag nature. Just, it's a bunch of poor undead who need housing, to just build a bunch of shacks. And it's entirely possible that when they were first built, it didn't look like this, but that once again, as the landscape shifts, as the first flame pulls everything towards it, these buildings and shacks have sort of started to crumble and teeter on the edge of cliffs and things like that. But this is not something that is exclusive to games. So I mentioned earlier one of the books that I wasn't going to discuss, and I'll just say briefly, it's called Earthquake Observers by Deborah Cohen, wherein she explores the origins of the Richter scale, and how the Richter scale was never meant to be a universal measurement of magnitude for earthquakes, but rather was meant to indicate the amount of damage. It is meant to be a relative scale to indicate the amount of damage that an earthquake reasonably ought to have done versus the amount that it actually did. So thereby drawing attention to poor building practices of the sort that we see here. So that is to say, people, in the interest of accumulating capital, build things of poor quality, in spite of the fact that it could one day lead to what would otherwise be a number of preventable deaths. Oh, I was waiting for that attack and then I didn't even get the parry. Okay, I'm gonna stop dancing with this guy and try to lead Hondrick over to his grave. Which, after I did this the first time, I don't fight him any other way anymore. Thank you, giant friend. Audric, over here, buddy. Oh, rip. Rip. Undead Blanchard. So we will read the description for that shortly, but there's some very, very interesting stuff that comes out of that. We also have some ashes to get over here too, so let's grab the ashes first. Draw these guys out so that our giant friend can take care of them. And obviously all of the arrows sticking out of the great arrows sticking out of the ground here were supposed to, if, unlike me, you didn't choose the Great Branch. If you didn't choose the Young White Branch as your starting gift, then, which is not something I did on my first playthrough, because I'm like, why the heck would you do that? It's a complete waste. You get one of them and that's it. Like, it seemed like such a waste to me. And I had no idea that it would actually be that effective. It has, for me at least, become basically the master key of this game, in that unless you're doing something really specific in terms of a challenge run, don't really pick anything else anymore. And so the item description for these ones are actually different. And what this implies to me, because they're not on corpses. So there are no corpses here. Which means that what we're doing when we pick up those young white branches is we're actually snapping a branch off of the tree. Which is very interesting. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I think that's the most reasonable explanation, because obviously we would have to go a fair bit higher in order to get that. So Undead Bone Shard. Undead bones that yet burn? Undead bones that yet burn. That's awkward. Cast it into the shrine bonfire to boost the recovery provided by the Estus flask. The bonfire cinders are the bones of undead, and a bone that still burns is a fresh cinder indeed. Before feeding upon death, one must first pray to it. I haven't the slightest clue what that means. Not the slightest clue. Maybe I'm more tired than I thought I was. So, Young White Branch used to transform into something which blends into the surroundings, which is actually different. Little Dusk's first sorcerer's staff eventually became a seedling, and then 3 white birch saplings. The young branch is said to still contain the echoes of Little Dusk's capriciousness. Really? So, I'll have to look up the definition of capricious to ensure that I'm not wrong when I say this, so that I can show it on the screen, so you can all verify that and laugh at me if I am. But capricious meaning that likely to change your mind at the last second, or just generally being unpredictable in terms of how it is that you will react or behave in certain circumstances, or how it is you will treat other people. Ouch. So this one has a flamberge, I believe. At one point I thought that this one was the only one that actually used a flamberge, and then I discovered that it's actually a really common enemy type. So that was a cleric set. I don't know if there's any significance to the place in which we find it. But we also have the Mortician's Ashes. And another tree that looks like it's destined to be cursed. So this entire place seems almost in the process that we're seeing. And once again, we'll get into this later, but there is a distinct sense, I think, in which traveling through the lands in this game, the landscape in this game, is not only a journey through space, but also a journey through time. And so, the closer we are to the first flame, which seems to be located in or around Lothric Castle, or directly beneath Lothric Castle. The closer we are, the farther back... Oh, it doesn't even really make any sense. The closer we are to the first flame, the farther back we are in time, and then as we go outwards, we're going forwards in time. So, if we're to look at it like that, which don't have to, this is just complete speculation, just a thought experiment, just something I've been thinking about. That as we're going back in time, and obviously they are distinct lands to some degree, but in a similar manner, which I suggested in the Old Hunters DLC for Bloodborne, that going from one Grand Cathedral and then traveling along the River of Blood to get to the other Nightmare Grand Cathedral, that you could look at that as a journey through time. I think there's something similar potentially happening here, whereby we're seeing a much earlier state of... No, so it does actually make sense, because when we're in Lothric, we're basically playing Dark Souls 1, with how the world is designed, or how the level is designed, and, you know, how everything fits together. And then the further away we get, we go forward in time to... and effectively it turns from Dark Souls 1 into Dark Souls 2. With the flat landscapes and you know, level design that many people have criticized, and I think in some cases justifiably so. But then if you look at the trees, we see these trees here that are in the very early stages of, you know, potentially transforming into something akin to the Curse of Rotted Greatwood. But then when we go to Farron Keep, we see that all of the trees have already basically transformed. Not to the extent that the Curse of Rotted Greatwood has, but then again, we also find Ulasil related things in Farron Keep. And, you know, several other things that wouldn't make sense if we were to look at it like that. So, just something I'm thinking about. But I would ask you to reserve your judgment until we talk about cosmology and all that stuff. But because it is my hope that all these things I'm saying will make much more sense when the time comes, or once I've properly contextualized it in that way. Great Scythe. Attacks with this large scythe, normally used for crop harvesting, are effective at breaking past shields. The magnificent, sharp, curved blade instills fear in opponents. Perhaps it is their survival instinct at work. So, I don't recall if I've mentioned specifically how we're going to be handling the multiple builds that we're going to be using throughout this playthrough. But one way in which we're going to do that is there will be an Aegon of Astora build in New Game Plus. But we're also going to have an additional New Game build which will be using that very weapon, the Great Scythe. So stay tuned for that. I had originally intended to introduce that character into the playthrough in this episode, but again, I think I've overloaded this episode enough in terms of the content. And so that's kind of the point I was trying to make earlier, was that it's tough for me because I always want to talk about so many things, and the classes I'm teaching on a weekly basis this year, I have an hour with one group of 25 and then an hour with another group of 25 students. It's not enough time. Like, I wish I had more time. And so I'm always forced to try and trim things down and to ensure that and, you know, obviously there's no limit in terms of, you know, I can make a 10-hour video if I wanted to, and, you know, I'm sure that some of you would watch it, but it's not so much that I'm concerned that you will all think that, you know, oh, he needs to make shorter videos, but more so that my computer just can't handle it. And I have, you know, obviously various other responsibilities, like the courses that I'm teaching is only one of many responsibilities that I have professionally and academically. So I unfortunately just don't have the time to do the length of episodes that I would otherwise love to do. Cleanse your curse. Interesting that I can't recall. I don't know if anyone has spoken to. I think JSF and Theomany Cassid have mentioned something about them calling us a bastard, but I don't remember where they went with that. Because that's a term that has obviously had various different meanings throughout history, but I think we're going to go back to Firelink, at least for now. So let's do that. Okay, I think that we're going to leave all of the NPC interactions here at Firelink until the next episode. So we'll start off the next episode in Firelink. We'll deal with, because we have to break the news to poor Grey Rat, for one. We have to talk to Yol and deal with the Dark Sigil and the Firekeeper Soul, which, interestingly enough, so I guess just until then, just because I found it so very interesting, is the fact that, thanks once again to Yosaho, we have a little bit more information about the Firekeeper Soul that we find on top of Firelink. So, the original text translates seemingly to tainted Firekeeper Soul. Specifically, it's said to be tainted, whereas the English translation is just Firekeeper Soul. Soul of a Firekeeper that returned from the Abyss long ago. This Firekeeper preserves the bonfire. She is said to have cured the dark holes, that is the Dark Sigil, of one champion which has tainted her soul. So I think that is to say that having cured the Dark Sigil, that you can't actually cure the Dark Sigil. The best you can do is transfer it. So just as when you use a purging stone, you're not getting rid of hollowing, you're just transferring it into this stone, which is itself a skull of sorts, if we have any on me. We do not. But nevertheless, so the act of curing the Dark Sigil actually, you know, the Firekeeper takes it upon herself, basically. So similar in a way to how Kalon, the Fair Lady from Dark Souls 1, is said to have basically sucked up, to have sacrificed herself and her own bodily well-being to get rid of, I believe it was the Blight Pus. And yeah, that you can't just get rid of these things. The best you can do is transfer them to someone else, or hope that someone sacrifices themselves by taking it, you know, allowing their body to be consumed by these things. But anyways, and Soul of Firekeeper will one day embed itself in the bosom of another Firekeeper. So I don't know what that last line, because of course if you take the Firekeeper Soul and you give it to our Firekeeper, then, you know, she mentions something similar. But does that mean that we are also tainting our Firekeeper as well? I don't know. But the word tainted, Yosaho writes, in her name is Kagare. And it uses... also means... I don't know what that means, but I'm sure it makes sense to someone. But again, thank you so much, Yosaho. These translations are so helpful and so interesting. So I hope that you all appreciate it and find it as interesting as I do.
Ah, well met. 'Tis good to see ye in good health. What needs smithing this day?
Alright. We need to give him our Estus Flask shard, which... I guess it makes more sense that he would be the one to reinforce your Estus Flask if it's just shards, you know, that he somehow is able to, even though we don't actually see the process of it happening. It'd be very interesting if we did. If we could see him somehow take our flask and then meld the shards into it, because otherwise, once again, this image from background after Dark Souls 2 was released I don't remember the name of the person who submitted it, but I'll put it on the screen now. Just hilarious. And so that's kind of what I picture and have pictured since I've seen that image. So it would be nice if there was a little bit more closure on that, but what are you going to do? Reinforced Estus Flask, increasing number of uses.
Prithee, be careful. I don't want to see my work squandered.
Sure thing, friend. But yeah. We have so much dialogue. So we have to talk to Leonhard, we have to talk to Hawkwood, we have to talk to, Grey Rat, we have to talk to Yol, and then we'll have to talk to, Yuria after that. Because we are going to get all 5 Dark Sigils with this build. But I'm not going to say what my plans are for the 3 builds and which ones are going to do which endings. That's something we'll all have to wait and see. But, yeah. And yeah, so in addition to all that, because of the whole thing with Yol and Yuria, we will also be going, using the key to get the Tainted Firekeeper Soul. I'm going to call it that for now on because I like that additional detail, and I find it really interesting that they would have left that out. And I'm interested to see whether the image for the item description actually shows something different than that which we see in Dark Souls 1. So, we'll see. Oi, oi, oi. So yeah, I really wish that... Rubbish. Why does he have rubbish? I think that's not the first time we've picked it up too. Who in their right mind would bother carrying this around? Perhaps you need help. So yep. And furthering the... And I know there's a lot of little details I've missed as I've been just rambling on and on about things that aren't necessarily related to what we're seeing on the screen, but we see this all over the Undead Settlement. And perhaps once again an indication that we're seeing some sort of timeline unfolding before us as we travel from one area to the next. Also worth noting that the Evangelist is not a single spawn, so suggesting that there's a considerable presence. That the Cathedral of the Deep has a considerable presence in this place. Which is not terribly surprising. Again, if we're to look at this place as sort of a an analog or a reference, intentional or otherwise, towards colonial practices in our world, past and present. Yeah, so I lied. My recording is actually nearing 2 hours now, so it is my hope that I will be able to cut a lot of stuff out. But once again, this area is just so enormous. And every time I play it, like, unless I'm just trying to get through it, and, you know, I'm not necessarily going for completion or anything like that, then it's, you know, it's not a problem. But when I am attempting to show everything in the area, just the way the area is laid out, I get overwhelmed by it. And I think that was probably the intent. But that could just be me. But yeah, I missed, during my blind playthrough, I missed like crow just flew through flew through a wall there. I missed like 90% of this stuff in this area in my first playthrough. Like, almost nothing. Well, that's not even worth it. And there are obviously plenty of ambushes here. Rip, friend. I'm sorry. And these ones with the blow darts are so annoying. They're not nearly as bad, of course, as the blow dart. What I don't know what their actual name is, so I've always just called them blow dart pricks in Dark Souls 1, but almost as annoying. At least they're not toxic blow darts. Makeshift shield cobbled together from wooden planks provides minimal protection and at the cost of moderate humiliation. Let's grab the rest of the items before we speak to the cage. Or however it is that we're supposed to refer to that thing, because I'm really not sure. And then we'll go fight the Curse Rod Greatwood. Then we'll talk about the ultimate fate of the universe. and then we will be addressing a few comments. As I mentioned earlier, considerably fewer comments than I had the time to address in the previous episode. So I will continue to say it, even though, you know, I hope that you all took my first one as sort of a blanket apology. But if you were hoping to have your comment read and I didn't read it, then I sincerely apologize. I really do. So, yeah. Oh, and another NPC I'm just realizing now that we'll have to talk to as well in the next episode is Cornix. So yeah, so the next episode will, I think, be Undead Settlement 2, but it might be Firelink Shrine 1. I don't want to spend the entire episode of Firelink, but at this point it's looking almost like we're going to have to. Because yeah, we got a lot of new dialogue, a lot of new NPCs, and we'll probably be switching in the next episode at least once in terms of builds, but we'll see.
Another Nana disappeared. Sir Granton carries a cage. He ever has his cage. And Nana's never coming back. So come into the cage and become Nana's shade.
Oh, so... yeah. I haven't the slightest clue. Like, not the slightest clue as to what to make of this other than a hint that you want to enter a cage if you can. Yosaho provided another translation here, which loosely translates from Japanese to disappeared granny alone again. So the term Nana is obviously one of several terms that you can use to describe or to refer to a grandmother. I call my grandmother Nanny, not Nana, but I don't know if it's a regional thing. My family was originally, or at least part of my family was originally from Germany, and then they moved here from the UK after World War II. But yeah, so the translation reads, disappeared granny alone again, so grandson is always carries a cage, grandson carries a cage, granny disappeared, enter somebody cage and become granny instead. And Yoso writes, a bit different but probably not important. So In other words, equally incomprehensible, I think, to the English dialogue.
Another Nana disappeared. Sir Granton carries a cage. He ever has his cage. And Nana's never coming back. So come into the cage and become Nana's shade.
So to become Nana's shade. And this is somewhere, and this is an instance, I think, where even though Yoso said it is probably not important, I think that this translation actually clarifies that line a little bit better. Because shade is another word that I perhaps should have looked up, but I didn't. Just because there's no way for me to, unless I go and I play through the entire area and make note of all the words that, you know, we might derive some clarity from defining them more specifically. Shade being... So in Dark Souls 2, a shade was basically a phantom that didn't last for quite as long. But my understanding of the word in general, or at least I think it means that sort of a shadow. So it could be another version of something. So when you are a shade in Dark Souls 2, you are yourself, but you phase in and I don't really know. But the translated text, become Granny instead, I think is a bit clearer than become become Nana's shade. Because it more directly makes the point that I think that we are supposed to be replacing Nana. Whoever Nana is, we are, I guess, being implored. They're imploring us to take Nana's place because she's never coming back. And again, no, I don't have the slightest clue as to what to make of that. So I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about that. So it's really... No, I was hoping that we'd be able to grab that from up here. But it's a really interesting turn, this whole sequence, because not only were we basically taught throughout the majority of the early part of this area that those cages are bad and they can kill you, but also that these guys are some of the toughest enemies in the game, or possibly the toughest enemy we've come to, or that we've come in contact with up to this point, save perhaps for the Evangelists and the Blue Lothric Knights. And yet, yeah, we have these two, and I don't know if they aggro at all, but you can lock onto this one. Does he get upset? No, I guess not. Well, let's see if that item fell down. It did. Oh, and Aegon and Irina. Wow, it's going to be NPC Central next episode. Maybe I'll try to blab a little bit less than I tend to. We'll see. Wait for me, friend. Wait. So interesting little detail that I didn't notice until now, but right at the end of the cinematic we just saw, you actually see Hodrick kneeling before the altar as though he's offering vertebra shackles. So that's very, very interesting. Another thing that's really interesting is how the heck we got in here. And so presumably there's some sort of tunnel system here. A chute that we could have been dropped into. Because you see that we're obviously not the first ones to have been dropped down here. And at this point the ground isn't... At this point the ground isn't destroyed. And I really can't see where we would have been dropped in. You know what, since I'm unsure as to whether or not this recording is actually even going to be any good, because I updated my capture software in an attempt to allow me to stream directly from my capture card. And it was a whole thing. It was a mess. And I lost basically all my settings, so I have no idea whether the quality of this episode will even be any good and whether or not it's actually even recording properly. And not the smartest thing when you've already been recording for 2 hours to keep going like that. So I think we're going to deal with the Curse Rotted Greatwood in the next episode, because I'm also realizing now that there's a lot of stuff that we should probably touch on in this room, but that we don't really have the time to do. When I was streaming with Theomany earlier this week, something she pointed out was the fact that, yeah, there's all this scaffolding here on the side, suggesting that whatever it is that's happening here has been going on for a very, very long time. But somehow, through some sort of tunnel or something, our cage was dropped here. Presumably just like many of the broken cages over there, evidence of other people having been dropped. But some of them are they're just dumping bodies here. And I would say perhaps as a sacrifice to the Curse Rotted Greatwood, but of course we're underneath. Like, the Curse Rotted Greatwood isn't down here. So I really don't know. So we can see that he doesn't really look hollow. And I suppose it's possible that he's using an untrue dark ring, but I'm not so sure. War God Wooden Shield. Wooden shield reinforced with metal, the largest of the largest of the wooden medium shields. The bizarre pattern featured on the shield is in the mark of a mad god. The bizarre pattern featured on the shield is the mark of a mad god, revered as a god of war in remote regions. And it appears to be similar to the Twin Dragon Great Shield. So seemingly a reference to the Nameless King. I don't know why it would be down here, though.
Well, what's up? This pit is for hollows, not for the likes of you sane folk. Or perhaps you are a hollow, posing as otherwise? No, of course you're not. That's what you mad fools always say. But we'll all be mad soon enough. And should you be undead, well, all the more so. Beware, the shackles of the gods are fragile. You might need this. Etch it on your heart if you feel your sanity slipping. Come here to pile up your victims, for that will form your anchor. You'll see when you go mad. They'll be your family.
So really in stark contrast to the likes of Solaire in Dark Souls 1, where, he suggests very strongly and demonstrates, I think, throughout the game that you can accomplish much more together. Whereas Hodrick is saying that you should basically build your own accomplishments on the misery and death of others. Which is kind of messed up. A malformed vertebra found by the mad with a queer symbol on its inside, proof of the shackles of the gods, equipped to pledge oneself to the Moundmaker's covenant. The Moundmakers wish only to add to their mounds, becoming mad spirits whether summoned as cooperators or invaders. They are blithe to those around them, for in their minds any kill might lead to another shackle. Blithe is another word that I should probably look up. In the context of the sentence, I'm going to assume that it means something like they don't care about those around them, or they're hostile to those around them. Because all that matters is the shackle. Which, again, I don't know very much about the human skeletal system, so I don't really know. I guess this is a part of the spine or the midsection? I don't know. But we do have we got one for killing Hodrick. A special bone collected by members of the Covenant of Moundmakers, discovered in the corpses of their victims. Only one such bone is found in the vertebrae, and the Moundmakers believe it to be a shackle of the gods. In their minds, each victim is another connection, an addition to the family. A shackle of the gods. Not sure what that means. Because my initial impression would be shackle as in, they're being constrained by the gods. But, I don't know. Because why would they be seeking this if it was supposed to be a shackle? If they were being shackled by the gods, by the verb, I really don't know. I think that's a good sign that it's time to move on to our exploration of it's like the 15th tease so far today, our exploration of the ultimate fate of the universe.
You'll go mad one day, but not today. Take my advice. Use this bone and leave this place. This pit is for hollows, and for the occasional madman fond of piling up victims. You've better things to do, I'd hope.
Yeah, we gotta talk about the ultimate fate of the universe, so thank you kindly for the homework bone, even though we technically didn't need it. Yeah, I wish I could just keep recording, but again, yeah. Okay, finally, the ultimate fate of the universe. Let's get started. Links to everything that we're going to be discussing can be found as usual in the video description below. Starting with an article from Wikipedia with that very name, Ultimate Fate of the Universe. The ultimate fate of the universe is a topic in physical cosmology. Many possible fates are predicted by rival scientific hypotheses, including futures of both finite and infinite duration. Once the notion that the universe started with a rapid expansion, nicknamed the Big Bang, became accepted by the majority of scientists, the ultimate fate of the universe became a valid cosmological question, one depending on the physical properties of the mass energy in the universe, its average density, and the rate of expansion. So in order for us to talk about all of those constituent ideas and theories, we're going to talk a little bit about the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. And so the Hubble Space Telescope in general, and the deep field images in particular, is something that I've long been interested in. So much so that in the hallway leading into my apartment, I have this thing, which is much larger than it appears, I think, in this picture. And you can actually see me, you can actually see my reflection, because I couldn't figure out a good angle from which to take the photo where you wouldn't see my reflection. But yeah, This is an image that has long been very important to me and that I found very interesting, in no small part because I think it provides one of the most readily understandable and one of the most, if not the most powerful illustration of the idea that space and time are connected, that they are one and the same. So in order to explain how this image came to be, we're going to be watching a couple of excerpts from two different videos. The first one being the Hubble Ultra Deep Field in 3D by Tony Darnell of Deep Astronomy, and the second one called Galaxy Evolution by the Goddard Space Flight Center at NASA. I highly recommend that you check out both videos, but the Tony Darnell video in particular, because I think his video was the first one that really helped me understand what it means to say that space and time are connected. And he does an incredible job of conveying how profound that fact is. So without further ado, here's how Tony Darnell explains the Hubble Ultra Deep Field and the Hubble Deep Field prior to it.
Astronomers in 1996 attempted to do something extraordinary. They pointed the Hubble Space Telescope into a part of the sky that seemed utterly empty, a patch devoid of any planets, stars, and galaxies. This area was close to the Big Dipper, a very familiar constellation, and the patch of sky was no bigger than a grain of sand held out at arm's length. They opened the telescope and slowly, over the course of 10 full days, photons that had been traveling for over 13 billion years finally ended their journey on the detector of humanity's most powerful telescope. When the telescope was finally closed and the images were processed, the light from over 3,000 galaxies had covered the detector, producing one of the most profound and humbling images in all of human history. Every single spot, smear, and dot was an entire galaxy, and each one containing hundreds of billions of stars. In 2004, they did it again, using detectors with increased sensitivity and filters that allowed more light through than ever before. Over 10,000 galaxies appeared in what became known as the Ultra Deep Field. The photons from these galaxies left when the universe was only 500 million years old. And 13 billion years later, they end their long journey as a small blip on a telescope CCD. These galaxies, while standing absolutely still, are racing away from us, in some cases, faster than the speed of light. The space-time between us and everything else grows larger by the minute, pushing the galaxies in this image to a distance of over 47 billion light years. And because of universal expansion, the farther something is away from us, the more its light is shifted toward the red and the faster it appears to be moving. Edwin Hubble himself discovered this by measuring the redshift of many galaxies, and it's a measure of not only speed, but distance as well.
So there you have it. When we're looking at this image, we are not only looking out into space, we are also looking back into time. So again, the crucial takeaway, the crucial point here is that whereas in everyday life, and in our daily lives, light, for all practical purposes, travels instantaneously. You turn on a light and you don't have to wait, 5 minutes or whatever for the light to turn on. It turns on immediately. So, but even though it seems at such a small scale in our daily lives that light doesn't have a speed, that is just on or off, that's it. It does in fact have a speed. So because this point can't be emphasized enough, I really liked how it was explained in this NASA video, so let's have a look.
The deeper we look into space, the farther back we see in time.
Light travels 670 million miles an hour, but even at this speed, light from even the closest big galaxies takes millions of years to reach us.
Looking deep is looking back to when the universe was younger. Right now, our best tool for viewing the young universe is the Hubble Space Telescope.
This is Hubble's deepest view into space, known as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Here, astronomers have found galaxies so far away that their light began its journey to us more than 13 billion years ago.
We're seeing these galaxies as they were when the universe was just 600 million years old.
In human terms, this discovery is comparable to a teenager looking at a 6-month-old baby.
So, again, to restate that last point, because I wish I had lingered on that point a little bit longer and made it a bit more clear, but it's not just a teenager looking at a photo of a 6-month-old baby. It's like you took a selfie of yourself. It's that you take a selfie of yourself as a 16-year-old, and then when you look at the picture, it's you as a baby. And that way of articulating it, I think, does a really good job of explaining why it is that these notions can often be very difficult for us to grasp. And that's why I wanted to talk about all this, because often I'm guilty of this too, where I just say, oh yeah, big crunch. It looks like it's going to be a big crunch. And then I just sort of move on, sort of assuming that everyone else is crazy like me and, was at one point basically obsessed with astronomy and cosmology and things of that sort. But let's get into the real reason why I'm bringing this up as context for discussing the ultimate fate of the Dark Souls universe. And I'm sure that there are better sources and more up-to-date sources than this, but I'm taking you through basically how it is that I built my present understanding, amateurish though it may be, of cosmology. And it was in part from those videos that I just showed you, the Tony Darnell video in particular, but also from Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And so we're going to be reading a few excerpts from the book version of Cosmos, because it was, of course, also a television series. And I'm going to be quoting specifically from the 1985 edition, which is the edition that I own. So I should also point out that though he talks a fair bit about Hinduism and Hindu cosmology, I don't know nearly enough about Hindu cosmology or Hinduism more generally, and by not enough, I mean basically nothing, beyond that which I've read in this book. So this might be a horrible misreading of that cosmology. I have no way of knowing, so just keep that in mind as we go forward. So Carl Sagan writes that the Hindu religion is the only one of the world's great faiths dedicated to the idea that the cosmos itself undergoes an immense, indeed an infinite, number of deaths and rebirths. It is the only religion in which the timescales correspond, no doubt by accident, to those of modern scientific cosmology. Its cycles run from our ordinary day and night to a day and night of Brahma, 8.64 billion years long, longer than the age of the Earth or the Sun, and about half the time since the Big Bang. And there are much longer timescales still. There is the deep and appealing notion that the universe is but the dream of the god who, after 100 Brahma years, dissolves himself into a dreamless sleep. The universe dissolves with him until, after another Brahma century, he stirs, recomposes himself, and begins again to dream the great cosmic dream. In India, there are many gods, and each god has many manifestations. The Kola bronzes, cast in the 11th century, include several different incarnations of the god Shiva. The most elegant and sublime of these is a representation of the creation of the universe at the beginning of each cosmic cycle, a motif known as the cosmic dance of Shiva. The god, called in this manifestation Nataraja, the dance king, has 4 hands. In the upper right hand is a drum whose sound is the sound of creation. In the upper left hand is a tongue of flame, a reminder that the universe, now newly created, will billions of years from now be utterly destroyed. I found it very interesting that Carl Sagan wasn't the only scientist to be really intrigued by Nataraja, the dance king. Because as you can see, there's actually a statue of Shiva engaging in the Nataraja dance at CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Carl Sagan goes on to write that these profound and lovely images are, I like to imagine, a kind of premonition of modern astronomical ideas. Very likely, the universe has been expanding since the Big Bang, but it is by no means clear that it will continue to expand forever. The expansion may gradually slow, stop, and reverse itself. If there is less than a certain critical amount of matter in the universe, the gravitation of the receding galaxies will be insufficient to stop the expansion, and the universe will run away forever. But if there is more matter than we can see, hidden away in black holes, say, or in hot but invisible gas between the galaxies, then the universe will hold together gravitationally and partake of a very Indian succession of cycles. Expansion followed by contraction, universe upon universe, cosmos without end. If we live in such an oscillating universe, then the Big Bang is not the creation of the cosmos, but merely the end of the previous cycle, the destruction of the last incarnation of the cosmos. Neither of these modern cosmologies may be altogether to our liking. In one, the universe is created, somehow, 10 or 20 billion years ago, and expands forever. The galaxies mutually receding until the last one disappears over our cosmic horizon. Then, the galactic astronomers are out of business, the stars cool and die, matter itself decays, and the universe becomes a thin, cold haze of elementary particles. In the other, the oscillating universe, the cosmos has no beginning and no end, and we are in the midst of an infinite cycle of cosmic deaths and rebirths, with no information trickling through the cusps of the oscillation. Nothing of the galaxies, stars, planets, life forms, or civilizations evolved in the previous incarnation of the universe oozes into the cusp, flutters past the Big Bang, to be known in our present universe. If the universe truly oscillates, still stranger questions arise. Some scientists think that when expansion is followed by contraction, when the spectra of distant galaxies are all blue shifted, causality will be inverted, and effects will precede causes. First the ripples spread from a point on the water's surface, then I throw a stone into the pond. First the torch bursts into flame, and then I light it. We cannot pretend to understand what such causality inversion means. Will people at such a time be born in the grave and die in the womb? Will time flow backwards? Do these questions have any meaning? And so we'll get into that last bit in a second, but what he's referring to here is what is today known as the cyclic model. So a cyclic model, per Wikipedia, or oscillating model, is any of several cosmological models in which the universe follows infinite or indefinite self-sustaining cycles. For example, the oscillating universe theory, briefly considered by Albert Einstein in 1930, theorized the universe following an eternal series of oscillations, each beginning with a Big Bang and ending with a Big Crunch. In the interim, the universe would expand for a period of time before the gravitational attraction of matter causes it to collapse back in and undergo a bounce. So instead of it technically being a Big Bang, that would be, I guess, the Big Bounce theory, which sounds silly, but I think it's really interesting. And so turning finally to the notion of the Big Crunch, which is a term that I've mentioned previously, but I've never actually properly explained. So the Big Crunch is one possible scenario for the ultimate fate of the universe, in which the metric expansion of space eventually reverses and the universe recollapses, ultimately ending as a black hole singularity, or causing a reformation of the universe, starting with another Big Bang. Sudden singularities and crunch or rip singularities at late times occur only for hypothetical matter with implausible physical properties. So what does all this mean for Dark Souls? So as I was hinting at throughout basically the entirety of this episode, and probably annoying everyone in the process while doing it, it's really, really important to understand that clearly we have some preliminary understanding of what's happening. We really don't know. And in fact, it's impossible for us to know. Because, again, the time scales involved are so disproportionate to that of our own lives. You know, we're talking tens of billions of years, and we live, if we're lucky, 80 or 90 years. So just as we'll never know, at least in our lifetimes, for certain whether or not a big crunch will happen. But let's say that we assume that the big crunch will happen. If, like in Dark Souls 3, the world starts at a singularity, and it seems to me that the world, or at least the present shape of it, started with the first flame, expanded outwards for Dark Souls 1 and 2, and then started closing in again, started drawing everything back towards it, just like we see at the killing of the first flame, then, one of several things might happen at that point. So the ultimate conclusion of the Dark Souls series, insofar as this is the last of the numbered Dark Souls games, the ultimate conclusion is, fittingly, open-ended. That is to say, it seems apparent that sooner or later a big crunch will take place. Where the open-endedness exists, however, is in what happens after that. Will the big crunch create another first flame? once all of the matter is squished into a singularity, once the big crunch is complete, will we have another Big Bang? Will it be a big bounce? Will there be a big rip? So there are several different possibilities, but what I found most intriguing about the questions that Carl Sagan raises is that it never really sat well with me, the notion that the world of Dark Souls would just simply end. Because, to a certain degree, all of FromSoft's games incorporate cycles. Infinite, endless cycles. And in this case, I think that rather than just conceiving of the first flame sucking everything towards it, becoming a singularity, and the universe just ending, I think it's actually far more likely that the first flame take everything towards it, pull everything towards it until it's a singularity, and then there would be some sort of other Big Bang or, expansion of the universe, such that, we'll have another incarnation of the universe, of the world. And so in this context, that, with this understanding that we know a fair bit, but the more we know, the more we recognize what little we know. Each of these cosmologies is based on a certain set of assumptions of how the laws of the universe operate, based in no small part on things like the Doppler shift, which, you can tell by the color of the galaxy how fast it's moving away from us. But again, as Carl Sagan pointed out, we don't know what would happen if the expansion of space would suddenly, be inverted. If space starts contracting, it could very well be that our present understanding of causality would simply not apply. All of this is to say that not only do I think this gives us some hints as to the ultimate fate of this universe, in that I'm of the view that the kiln is probably the truest representation of the present state of the world, where everything is just, and so that the details around that is something that we obviously still need to figure out, but I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that if in fact we're witnessing a big crunch, then it's more likely, knowing FromSoft, knowing their influences, and knowing their affinity, I don't know, I think it's a cultural thing, but I don't know for certain. I don't know if that's something that many of the Eastern cultures and religions have in common, because as Carl Sagan pointed out, Hinduism is predicated on the notion of a cyclical universe. And also raises questions about the multiverse as well, but that's another can of worms, and we've already opened up enough of them in this episode. So it could very well be that what we're experiencing in the world, the reason why things don't make sense in many cases, and again, I'm not using this as an explanation for all the things that don't make sense, because there's some places that even this can't explain. But with this framework, I think we're much more capable of understanding why some of these seemingly inexplicable things are happening in the world. Because our understanding of causality and the laws of physics and nature are predicated on the expansion of space and not its contraction. So for all we know, causality could be completely inverted in the world of Dark Souls as a result of the first flame pulling everything back towards it. And what's more is that the further away from the first flame that we get, it's also possible that we are also traveling back in time. So if the first flame is the singularity from which the universe of Dark Souls expanded, then it is entirely possible that as we get further away from the first flame, we are traveling back in time in the same way that when we look at a photo of the Hubble Deep Field, we are not seeing these galaxies as they presently are. We're seeing them as they were 13 billion years ago. So obviously there's an enormous difference in the scales involved, but just something to think about. And something I think that 99% of the people who go, lol, time is convoluted, lol, FromSoft so silly with fan service, that I don't think any of those people are considering any of these possibilities. And to a certain extent, yes, this is hand-waving, but this is a framework, whether or not FromSoft intended, this is a framework through which we can make sense. A conceptual framework, I think, through which we can make sense of the game and its story, or at least pieces of it, if not the entire thing. So yeah, I hope that that was at least semi-coherent and semi-understandable, and that you at least took something away from this, if not a better understanding of how the story of the game might work and how the world might operate. Then at least maybe you found the deep field thing interesting. I hope so. And once more, there are probably better sources of information, better sources I could have cited in order to, illustrate all these points. But what I was taking you through just now was basically the things that I looked to and the literature that I was exposed to, which not only sparked my interest in this subject, but also which provided for the first time, perhaps not coincidentally, an illustration of these concepts that I could actually grasp. Because prior to, these revelations with the deep field images that I had, I did not understand space-time at all. But yeah, moving on to the comments, because I've blabbed on long enough. But do let me know if you have any questions or you need clarifications on anything that I discussed, and I will do my best to address those in the next episode. So once again, before we get into it, please accept my sincerest apologies if I didn't get to your comment in this episode. This episode's already far too long as it is, so I would love to have touched on more comments, but unfortunately I just don't have the time. So I hope you understand and that you'll forgive me if I didn't get to your comment. Apex27 writes, I was always under the assumption that Vort and the Dancer were coming out of a portal that may lead to the deep, or something like it, or the abyss even. The way that stuff drips out of the Dancer's portal is similar to the ooze that Artorias throws at you in his boss fights. So that is very, very interesting, and as I replied in a comment, it's one of those things that seems almost just so obvious when someone points it out. You're like, how the heck did I not even notice that or make that connection? But as Apex kindly and aptly pointed out, there are some things that I point out that he or she didn't notice. So it definitely goes both ways. But still, I'm very grateful that you raised this point, because it seems to me to be by far the most likely and sensible explanation. Just for the record, I think it makes more sense that they would be coming from emerging out of a portal from the deep specifically, as opposed to the abyss, simply because they serve Aldrich. And Aldrich is, of course, heavily associated with the deep. JSF writes, to clarify the dragon thing, what I meant is that the English script is using dragon, wyvern, and drake inconsistently, because there are different words in Japanese that define different kinds of dragon. What the Lothric Knights have tamed and are riding are almost certainly Hiryu, which specifically means flying dragon. Wyvern and drake are both good fits for that, because they basically imply big flying lizards, but not something as majestic as the everlasting dragons. However, the script is using them interchangeably along with dragon, hence the confusion. So thank you kindly, JSF, for pointing that out, and I'm sorry if I misquoted you in the prior episode. If I did, it was certainly not intentional. But thank you very kindly for your clarification. So va writes that, so I'm not sure if anyone has noted this, but I want to point out that Ludleth is pretty much the first character in the entire series, with a kind of archaic, Middle English-ish sociolect, without messing up the grammar at all. What I mean is that, for example, Priscilla says, "What seeketh thee?" when surely she must have meant, "What seeketh thou?" Ludleth, on the other hand, speaks consistently correctly and never makes any mistakes. So that's very interesting, and not something that we have all that much time to go into right now, but I did want to raise this comment for now, and I will try to remember to return to this when we discuss Ludleth in greater detail, but it could very well help us understand Ludleth as a character, and also perhaps where he's from, his homeland, and the significance of those things. So something to keep in mind whenever we discuss Ludleth in forthcoming episodes. Centimeter Worm writes, I love your speculation on the unkindled ash being the Lord Vessel, but I always thought that the Lord Vessel was the basin that we stick the coiled sword in at the Firelink Shrine bonfire. Hence how we are already able to warp from the start. The markings on its sides are eroded, but they do match up fairly well. And as we already know, from the clutter details from Firelink Altar and Dark Souls 1, there was more than one Lord Vessel. I don't know if that holds up under scrutiny, but I felt like sharing it. What's more is that Scholar of the Worst Game kindly shared with us a screenshot courtesy of Bart172, and I tracked down the post on Reddit, which we'll get to in a second, but just to show you the image that Scholar of the Worst Game provided here. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. I don't know if this is the Lord Vessel, per se, or if perhaps it is just a basin? I honestly do not know. I'm not married to the idea that the player character is herself the Lord Vessel. I think it's interesting, but this is something that, I really don't know, because this is interesting on several levels to me, because I've been on the record as not being a fan or of being disappointed in the fact that whenever you want to go, for example, to Firelink to check to see if you have a seed of a Tree of Giant waiting for you, that you have to wait for something like 20 or 30 seconds for the fog gate to disappear, for the area outside of Firelink to load. And yet, to have a part of the geography fully textured but completely invisible to the player, it seems kind of, I don't want to say lazy, but I guess to a certain degree all of the Souls games have been rushed to some extent or another. There's always cut content, there's always weird things like this. But this just, I think, is weird. In that I don't know what to make of it. Because, and again, it's not because I'm married to the idea that the player character is herself, literally the Lord Vessel. Because I still think the point stands, even if it's not, the specific Lord Vessel from Dark Souls 1. But I also don't know if this is the Lord Vessel, if it's the same Lord Vessel. Because it looks to me almost like it could be, it seems like this is the same model as the one that we find throughout the game. So that is, there's one in the Untended Graves, there's one before the Untended Graves where we get the Path of the Dragon gesture, also where we pick up the Estus Flask and the Ashen Estus Flask. I think that's it, but there may be one or two more. And it's very interesting to me, but seeing as we were never technically supposed to see this, it's similar, I think, to the half-transformed Celestial in Yosefka's clinic in Bloodborne. If before this was patched, you did the Yosefka's clinic skip, and you jumped over the coffin, and you went into Yosefka's clinic, you would find the half-transformed Celestial in that same room where you'd find it otherwise. So you could say that maybe it was the actual Yosefka, the true Yosefka, the one we first meet, who was responsible for transforming that person into a Celestial and failing at it, seemingly. But on the other hand, you could also point to the fact that since we're never intended to see that at that point in the game, that can't really be evidence of anything. Because we're not supposed to see it. So of course they're not going to take the time and effort, especially when they're constantly being rushed to get the next game out. They're not going to go through the time and effort of removing that model until later in the game, because again, it was a glitch. We used a glitch to get into that area prior to when we were actually supposed to be able to access it. So it's really hard to say whether that can be considered evidence. This is perhaps a little bit different. It's a little bit easier, I think, to accept this as evidence that, the Lord Vessel is basically a platform for the bonfire, I guess. I don't really know. And again, it's just doubly curious to me, considering the fact that the game needs to load all of these assets, and it's just not optimized very well. If you have these textures and everything that are loading in under the game world, where they're not supposed to be seen. And so just to give credit where it's due and all that, Bart172 actually posted this on Reddit 2 weeks ago, and pointed out that they used Cheat Engine on PC. Also, it's pretty interesting how the model and the texture aren't the same as the ones in Dark Souls 1. So I've not verified that myself, but I will have to double check that at some point. The problem is, again, I lost all of my saves in Dark Souls 1 a while back, and the only build I have is the build that I use for my casual playthrough of the game, which just finished a few months ago, and which is still I think, sitting in the Northern Undead Asylum in New Game Plus. So I will have to advance at some point with that build and see if we can get a better look at it to compare the two. But all this is very, very interesting, so thank you everyone for bringing this stuff up. Something that I said in the previous episode I wanted to test, but I didn't get an opportunity to. Matteolino Matteino, I'm sorry for butchering your name, kindly pointed out that Albert will actually black crystal out if you attack Emma. And I agree very much with Apex27, who wrote, for real? If that's true, that is so cool of FromSoft, wow. So again, really interesting that on the one hand they would stick a Lord Vessel type basin under the map when it can't be seen, thus taking resources away from that might otherwise be used to allow us to exit Firelink without waiting for loading screen or without waiting for the fog gate to go away, and yet they put in these strange little details at the same time. So, but yeah, further to the point that I was making in that episode, that Albert clearly does not want us to enter Lothric Castle, at least not yet. Dezo Penguin writes, I've come to see the 5 thrones of the lords here as basically a symbolic reenactment of the Chosen Undead's journey in Dark Souls 1. 4 lesser thrones representing the 4 Lord Souls that the Chosen Undead collects, and 1 greater throne representing the Chosen Undead, and also the bearer of the curse, in that the one who occupies it becomes a king, as does the one who takes the throne of want, becoming a true monarch. Again, I think this is why the top throne here is Holy King Lothric, for it awaits Prince Lothric to take the throne and become a king as the new Lord of Cinder. The Unkindled here serves as the ultimate backup system for all the souls, including the extra soul strength that Lothric brings to the table. For their part, Yosaho argued that it's possible that the top throne could correspond to God, the middle throne to humans, and the lower thrones to monstrosities, which, again, very interesting possibility, and I like both of these, I really do. Dezo Penguin goes on to write that the Deep Battle Axe is probably a gameplay mechanic issue. First area of the game, optional enemy, nice weapon for that area to be found as a reward, and a weapon sitting in a chest in an area filled with armories and soldiers' quarters and so on. Seems respectably fitting. I can't think of any actual lore explanation as to why that Deep Battle Axe would be there. So this might just fall below the gameplay storyline in terms of it being just a gameplay mechanic. But I can certainly speak to its effectiveness, having started several weeks ago my Soul Level 1 run in Dark Souls 3, which I've not gone back to since that live stream, but I think I killed Vort in like 3 or 4 hits or something like that once I fully upgraded it. So yeah, maybe it'd be cool if we could come up with some sort of reason for it, but I honestly can't think of any. I think what bugs me about the Lothric Civil War is the comment in late game that the Angelic Faith was opposed by all 3 pillars, but we know that there is a split within the pillars as well about linking the fire. I've never thought about it until now, until you juxtapose them next to one another in this episode, but Lothric's apparent culture of self-sacrifice seems almost commented upon by the Ring of Sacrifice, where the act of self-sacrifice itself is stated by the ring not to have any specific value on its own as an independent virtue, whether because of honor or whatever, but only by its externally measurable, tangible value, the life that it saves. Sacrificing oneself to accomplish a goal is worthy, sacrificing oneself in a mere attempt without accomplishment is meaningless. Very well said. Very, very well said. And one more thing that Dezo Penguin wrote that I wanted to comment on briefly is I think there's nobody in these comments who wants you to restrain yourself and force you to shorten things up. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, or maybe not because I might have cut it out in the final edit, but the reason I want to keep these videos shorter is that those of you out there watching will be displeased about it, or will think that it's lazy or something like that. But just because the longer the episode is, the more work it is for me. So the longer it takes to edit, the longer it takes to render, the more time I have to devote to waiting, the more time my computer is tied up rendering things, or my laptop is tied up processing audio. So when I say I want to keep these things short, it's in large part, like 99% of the reason for that is just that, yeah, I have to limit myself somehow, because I'm the type of person that when I'm passionate about something, I can get carried away. And, you know, I often do. So the comments about keeping the episode shorter is more so just about me knowing myself and my own tendencies and the things I need to work on, and less about me being concerned that viewers will not take too kindly to the length of the episodes. But I really do appreciate the sentiment behind what you're saying, and I hope that everyone else agrees that, because this episode I think is going to be even longer than the previous one. So, but yeah, thank you kindly. Finally, Aresh writes, I imagine Udex Gundir gained his title in a trial by combat in the festivities he was said to have missed in the alternate world, given the stadium he seems to reside in, so that is the boss room. And second, the wings worn by the faux winged knights seem to be based on the Polish winged hussars. And yeah, with the provided image, pretty much. It looks so silly, and maybe it's just because it will forever be associated in my mind with, you know, the fat winged angels, but yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for sharing. These knights seem to have been depicted as actual angels in paintings and such, though their role as cavalry in real life seems to be where this ends, though the picture of the large knights on a struggling horse is amusing. That it certainly is.
Oh no! No! I'm sorry. Oh my god. Oh my god. Alright, I'm saving that.
But yeah, I am exhausted. Really exhausted. I shouldn't have recorded for nearly this long, and again, that's why, for the most part, I want to try and limit the length of these episodes, because when I'm excited about things, when I'm passionate about things, I can just keep going and going and going, and then I don't realize until, like, it's far too late when, you know, I'm done recording, like, presumably as soon as I stop recording. Here, I will just sort of slump over and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. That's basically, if you ever wonder what happens immediately after my live streams end, I just zonk out. But that's going to do it for this episode. So thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.